11 nights she had been found there, and on the 12th, the Duke of Ashworth stopped ordering her removed. The ballroom at Carrington Hall blazed with 300 candles distributed among 6 tiers of crystal chandelier, and the combined effect was something closer to fever than to light. The Countess of Fenwick had arranged the room with the precision of a general deploying troops. Hothouse roses in ivory and gold at every pillar, footmen stationed at 8-foot intervals along the south wall, a string quartet positioned near the tall windows so that the music might drift through the opened casements, and give the garden an elegance it had not actually earned. Every woman present wore something pale or shimmering. Every man wore the correct shade of dark. The room performed its function without fault, which was to say that everyone within it looked as though they had never struggled with anything. And at the edge of all that arranged magnificence, seated at the writing table tucked beside the servants' corridor, where no guest had any business being, was Charlotte Reeves. She wore gray, not the soft silver that the candlelight might have dignified, but the particular gray of a dress worn for 2 successive seasons, because there had been no occasion grand enough to justify the expense of another. She had brought a small ledger. She had also brought a list of 47 items that required resolution before the evening concluded, because the Countess of Fenwick was her cousin by marriage, and the Countess of Fenwick had not arranged a single element of this evening herself. Charlotte had arranged it. She had arranged it in the 6 days prior to the event, while the Countess held opinions about the roses, and changed her mind about the tablecloths 4 times. Charlotte had negotiated the quartet's fee down from their first asking price by 11 shillings. She had identified that the main chandelier's central chain required tightening, and had climbed a footstool at 2:30 in the afternoon to address it herself, because the footman assigned to the task had not understood the mechanism. She had counted the candles. She had reseated 3 tables when the Countess's guest list expanded by 5 names at noon on the day itself. None of this was visible in the finished room. That was, she had come to understand, precisely the point. She was making a notation in the ledger. The florist had delivered 14 fewer stems than the agreed total and had not yet adjusted the invoice, when she became aware that the room's noise had shifted. Not louder, differently arranged. She looked up. The Duke of Ashworth had arrived. He entered without announcement, which was either a deliberate choice or an authority so settled it required no theatrical introduction. He was tall, dressed in a black tailcoat that held no embellishment whatsoever, and he moved through the room the way a surveyor moves across unfamiliar ground, noting, measuring, not particularly impressed. The Countess of Fenwick intercepted him at the second pillar. Lady Hargrove, who was 23, and exceptionally beautiful, and had been positioned near the piano for most of the evening to excellent visual effect, turned her face toward him with the precision of a compass finding north. The room redistributed itself around his presence without quite acknowledging it was doing so. Charlotte returned to her ledger. She wrote the florist's name and the shortfall in stems and the sum owed. She was halfway through the line when she noticed she was being watched. Not the general, passing notice of a man whose eye had swept a room. Something more considered than that. She looked up a second time, and found the Duke of Ashworth looking directly at her, from a distance of perhaps 20 feet, his expression entirely unreadable. He was not looking at her with any of the things she had learned to expect from men who noticed her at all. Not assessment, not dismissal, not the particular blankness of someone deciding she was not relevant. He was looking at her in the way a person looks at something they have not been able to categorize. After a moment he turned away. Lady Hargrove said something that made him incline his head. Charlotte noted the remaining stem shortfall, closed the ledger, and went to check that the second tier of refreshments had been properly arranged, because nobody else would. She had managed the Countess of Fenwick's household for 4 years, 7 months, and 12 days, and in that time she had learned that the person being overlooked in any room is often the person keeping the room standing. Her father had died when Charlotte was 19, not dramatically, not tragically, but in the slow and grinding manner of a man who had mismanaged a modest estate for a decade and finally exhausted its capacity to recover. There had been debts. Charlotte had not known about all of them when he died, which meant she had discovered them in sequence over the weeks that followed his funeral, each one arriving by post like a particularly unwelcome guest. The estate in Shropshire, which which had belonged to her father's family for 3 generations, had a creditor on the Northfields deed, and another on the grain revenues, and a third who held a lien on the house itself, that Charlotte had found only after she had gone through every paper in the study, in systematic order, over the course of 9 days. Her mother's brother, a man named Gerald Carrington, had arrived 3 weeks after the funeral, and explained that he would assume management of the estate. He had not asked her to leave. He had simply begun to manage it in such a way that there was no longer any role for her to fill, except that he did not actually know how to manage it, which meant that Charlotte had continued doing everything she had been doing, but now without any authority to do it, which was a distinction that made itself felt in 100 small ways daily. She kept the accounts. She negotiated the tenancy agreements. She identified that the Northfields yield had declined 3 years running because the drainage channel had silted and needed to be cleared, and she arranged for it to be cleared. She drafted the correspondence to the creditors and proposed the repayment schedule that eventually satisfied 2 of the 3. Gerald reviewed what she gave him, occasionally changed a word, and signed his name. He had not been a cruel man. That had been one of the hardest things to hold accurately in her mind. He had not been cruel. He had simply been a man in a world that had handed him authority and handed her invisibility, and neither of them had made that arrangement. She was not going to step aside for anyone, but the machinery did not require her to step aside. It only required her to keep working while the credit went elsewhere. She had managed the Shropshire estate's recovery from significant debt to modest solvency in 3 years and 4 months. The total recovered margin over that period was, by her final accounting, £460, a figure she knew with precision because she had calculated it twice. When Gerald eventually sold the estate to settle his own separate financial difficulties, Charlotte had accepted a position in the Countess of Fenwick's household as the woman the family called a companion to the Countess, because companion was a word that had a kind of social texture to it that other words did not. She organized the household. She managed the accounts. She negotiated with tradespeople and creditors and suppliers. She planned events, arranged transportation, corresponded with the solicitor, reviewed lease agreements for the Countess's 2 properties, and occasionally sat with the Countess in the drawing room, while the Countess complained about the quality of the season's entertainments. For this she received £30 annually, and a room on the 3rd floor with a good east window. She had not broken. She had come close enough to feel the edge of it, once, the night she had sat in the Shropshire study with the 3rd creditor's letter, and realized the extent of what was owed. She had pressed her hand against the wall, the cold plaster, which was real and solid, and she had made a decision. It was not precisely a decision to be brave. It was more like a decision to remain herself, which was a quieter thing, but in some ways more durable. Then she had picked up her pen and written the repayment proposal. There had been one person in those years who had looked at her with clear eyes, an old schoolmaster named Mr. Forsyth, who had taught her father's tenants' children, and who occasionally helped Charlotte review the agricultural accounts, had said to her once, without ceremony, "You have a better mind for this than most solicitors I have met, Miss Reeves. I hope someone will eventually tell you so officially." He had died the following winter, but she had held the words with care, not as comfort exactly, but as a record. He had seen what was there. She had not imagined it. Now she arranged other people's chandelier chains, and drafted other people's correspondence, and negotiated fees that other people signed for. And she did it well, and she knew she did it well, and she had learned not to count on things that merely looked like rescue. The Duke of Ashworth had arrived at the Countess of Fenwick's ball by invitation, and also by intention, though the nature of his intention was known only to himself and to his man of business, a precise and undemonstrative solicitor named Edward Hartwell, who had worked for the Ashworth family for 19 years, and who had provided the Duke with a report 3 days earlier. The report had been commissioned 8 weeks ago, shortly after the Duke had attended a separate gathering, at which the Countess's household management had come up in conversation. He had not been attending to the conversation particularly. He had been attending to the fact that a dinner for 60 guests had been organized with a logistical precision he had rarely encountered, and he had asked his hostess, in the middle of dessert, who had arranged it. His hostess had looked briefly puzzled, and said she believed it was Cecilia Fenwick's companion, a Miss Reeves, who had done most of the actual organizing, though she had not done it officially. Officially, he had noted the word. He had returned to Ashworth Park afterward, and sat in his study for a long while. The study was the room he occupied most reliably. It had been his mother's before it became his. She had used it for correspondence and for reading, and for the household accounts she had insisted on maintaining herself, though a man of business could have done it. She had died when Dominic was 14, and the room had remained largely as she had left it for years afterward. Not from sentiment, but because Dominic had found he thought more clearly there than anywhere else in the large and somewhat oppressive house. He had eventually made it his own by degrees, his books on the lower shelves, his papers across the desk, his particular system of account organization that allowed him to locate any document within 60 seconds. The room worked because he had made it work. The estate at Ashworth Park had been declining in a slow and documented way for 11 years. Not dramatically, not in the manner of a family that had made catastrophic choices. More in the manner of a household that had been managed by men of middling competence who had made individually defensible decisions that accumulated into a pattern of quiet retreat. The North Farm's yield was down. 3 of the 8 tenant agreements had not been renegotiated in 7 years. The household accounts showed a pattern of small, unexamined expenditures that, totaled, represented a sum that made Dominic's expression go flat when he calculated it. He had been attempting to address these problems himself for 3 years, which was 3 years of work that had produced partial results because there were only so many hours, and he had learned estate management at the edge of other obligations. He had not wanted a wife to manage it. He had seen what happened when men of his position married women selected for social aptitude rather than practical intelligence. The estate's problems became invisible rather than resolved. He had not wanted to marry at all, if he was honest with himself, which he generally was. His mother had been the only person who had known how to talk to him without performing anything, and she had been gone for 22 years, and most social interactions since then had felt like attending a play where he had already read the script. But the estate needed something, and Hartwell's report had told him something worth reading. Miss Charlotte Reeves, age 27, educated beyond her formal schooling through practice and necessity, 4 years with the Countess of Fenwick. Prior to that, 3 years managing a modest estate in Shropshire during a period of significant financial difficulty. The debt recovery figures were in the report, and they were precise. Hartwell was not a man given to embellishment. He had written, "The margin recovered under Miss Reeves's management represents approximately £460 over 39 months, achieved primarily through renegotiated creditor terms, improved tenant agreements, and an agricultural intervention, drainage repair on the North Field, that the estate's nominal manager had not identified as necessary." And then, in a separate line that Hartwell had evidently considered worth the additional ink, "By all accounts I could locate, no credit for this recovery was assigned to Miss Reeves at any point." Dominic had read that line twice. Then he had set the report on his desk and gone to the window and looked at the Ashworth Park grounds in the gray November afternoon, and something had moved behind his careful expression. Not sentiment, but recognition. He had felt something of the same quality he felt when he identified a problem in an account column and understood, in a single clear moment, the exact mechanism of what had gone wrong. He had arranged to attend the Countess of Fenwick's ball. He had looked at Charlotte Reeves sitting at the edge of the room with a ledger, at a ball, which told him everything about where she actually lived, and the report had become a person, and the person had looked up and met his eyes without flinching, and without performance, and then had returned to her work with the composure of someone who had not required his attention in the first place. He had returned to Ashworth Park that evening and told Hartwell to arrange an introduction within the week. When the Countess of Fenwick informed Charlotte that the Duke of Ashworth wished to make her acquaintance, Charlotte set down her pen, looked at the Countess for a moment, and said, "I beg your pardon?" The Countess was visibly pleased by the situation, in the way that people are pleased by developments they have not caused, and therefore cannot be blamed for mismanaging. She said the Duke had expressed an interest in a particular competence, and had asked if Charlotte might be available for a conversation. Charlotte considered this for the length of time it took her to understand what was actually being proposed, which was longer than she generally needed for most things. Then she agreed to the introduction. The meeting took place in the Countess's morning room, with the Countess present for the first 8 minutes, and then conspicuously absent thereafter. The Duke sat across the writing table from Charlotte, and placed a document on the table between them. It was a summary of the Ashworth Park estate's financial situation over the preceding decade. He had prepared it himself. It was organized with the clarity of someone who thought in columns, and found disorder a kind of inefficiency. He said, "I am told you managed a debt recovery in Shropshire that Hartwell described as the most competent response to an agricultural estate's financial difficulty that he had reviewed in the past 10 years. He is not generous with assessments." Charlotte looked at the document rather than at him. She turned 2 pages. After a moment she said, "Your North Farm leases have not been renegotiated in 7 years. No. The terms in place predate the price changes of 1812. You are accepting below-market income on 4 of the 8 agreements. I am aware. Is Hartwell your solicitor for these agreements as well?" "He is." "Then Hartwell is aware also, and has not moved on it, which suggests either that the tenants have relationships with him that make the conversation awkward, or that he considers other matters more pressing." She looked up. "Which is it?" He said, "Both, to some degree." She returned to the document. He watched her read. She read with the particular attention of someone for whom a document is information rather than text. Her eyes moved in a pattern that was not decorative. After 4 minutes she set it down and said, "What are you proposing, Your Grace?" He had proposed, with the economy of a man who had thought through the arrangement beforehand, that Charlotte come to Ashworth Park as household manager, with a formal written appointment, a salary of £80 annually, and full authority over the household accounts. The title would be estate secretary, which was not a position that existed in the standard household structure, which meant he had invented it. He had also proposed, which was the part that required her to keep her expression perfectly still, that the arrangement might, if they found it suitable, be made more permanent in time, by which he meant marriage, which he had said with the same tone he had used for the salary figure. Charlotte said, "You have described a professional arrangement and a potential marriage in the same conversation." "Yes. Most people would separate those. I considered it more honest not to." She looked at him. He held her look without shifting. She picked up her pen and set it down again and said, "I would like to think about this completely before I answer." He said, "That is sensible." She thought about it for 2 days. She thought about it the way she thought about a complicated account, methodically, without sentimentality, looking for the places where the numbers did not balance. What he was offering was real work, with real authority, and a salary more than twice what she currently received. The marriage proposal was separate in her mind, or she tried to keep it separate, though she found the separation harder than the arithmetic. He had not pretended the arrangement was romantic. She respected that. He had also not pretended she was unsuitable, which was the thing she found herself returning to more than once in the 2 days. The world had built a very thorough case for her unsuitability, and he had set it aside without apparent difficulty. She had learned not to count on things that merely looked like recognition. But this did not quite look like recognition from a distance. This looked like someone who had gone and done the research. She sent him a letter accepting the professional position. She said she would address the question of the other matter when she had had sufficient time to form an opinion she trusted. He wrote back within a day, "Accepted on both terms. I have reserved the east-facing office adjacent to the study for your use. Hartwell will prepare the appointment document." She arrived at Ashworth Park on a Tuesday in early March, in a hired carriage with 2 trunks and her ledgers. The housekeeper, a solid and undemonstrative woman named Mrs. Laura Calvert, met her at the door with the particular composure of someone who had been given instructions and was determining whether to be reassured or alarmed. Mrs. Calvert showed her to the east office. It was a good room. It had a window that faced the grounds and enough shelf space, and a writing table that was newer than the rest of the furniture, which told Charlotte that the Duke had had it put there recently. She looked at the room for a moment. Then she opened the first trunk and began to set up her working system. The other person who met her that first week was a woman named Eleanor Vane, whose father was a baron and who had been a friend of the family for some years, and whose presence at Ashworth Park for the season was described variously as a visit and as a natural development by different people, in ways that conveyed their respective estimates of the situation. Eleanor was 25, very fair, beautifully dressed, and possessed of an absolute and serene certainty that she was in the correct position in any room she occupied. She was not unkind, but she had the specific quality of a person who has never needed to question whether they belonged. She introduced herself to Charlotte on the second day, with a warmth that was genuine and also entirely condescending, in the way that warmth can be when it comes from sufficient height. She said she was so glad the Duke had found someone to help with the accounts, and that the household had been a little at 6s and 7s, and that she hoped Charlotte would find the work manageable. Charlotte said she expected she would find it manageable. "Thank you." She said it pleasantly and went back to the ledgers. The institutional circle made itself felt more diffusely, but no less clearly. Hartwell visited within the week, and was courteous in the manner of a man who has been told to be courteous, and is complying without enthusiasm. The three investors who held interests in the estate's agricultural revenues, one a retired merchant named Mr. Bates, one a landowner from the neighboring county named Sir Philip Crane, and one a former business partner of the late Duke's whom everyone called Alderman Forsyte, sent letters inquiring about the new arrangement. Two of the letters were addressed to the Duke of Ashworth. One, from Alderman Forsyte, was addressed to Miss Reeves directly, and consisted largely of a request that she confirm her understanding of the limitations of her appointed role. She replied to Alderman Forsyte with a document. It was 3 pages. It contained, in organized sections, the current status of each of his interests in the estate's revenues, a proposed amendment to the revenue-sharing arrangement that would benefit both parties in 4 of the next 5 years under reasonable projections, and a polite notation that her appointed role was described in a formal letter signed by the Duke of Ashworth, a copy of which she enclosed. She signed it, Charlotte Reeves, Estate Secretary, Ashworth Park. Alderman Forsyte did not write back immediately. That was fine. The work itself she found absorbing, in the way that genuine problems are absorbing. The Ashworth Park estate had not been badly managed from malice. It had been managed from insufficient attention, and the accumulated habits of men who had inherited systems without examining them. She spent the first 12 days reading every lease agreement, every account ledger for the preceding 7 years, every supplier contract. She made notes in her own ledger in her precise, unhurried hand, and she organized the notes into 4 categories: immediate, requiring attention this quarter; medium, requiring attention this year; structural, requiring renegotiation; and historical, which was her word for problems that had calcified into assumptions and were going to require the most care to address. On the 16th day, she drafted her first formal report to the Duke. It was 12 pages. She had included specific figures for each category. Under immediate, she had identified a supplier contract for household provisions that was costing the estate an additional £40 annually, above the current market rate. The contract had auto-renewed 3 times without review. Under structural, she had laid out the case for renegotiating 6 of the 8 tenant agreements, with a projected improvement in annual income of between £200 and £240 depending on response rates. She left the report on the study desk with a note saying she was available to discuss it at his convenience. He came to find her in the East office that evening. It was the first time he had come to her, rather than the other way, and she noticed it the way she noticed most things, without expressing the noticing. He had the report in his hand. He sat down across from her. She had not quite invited him to sit, but she had not invited him either, and he had the sense to interpret the absence of either instruction correctly, and he placed the report on the table. He said, "The provisions contract, you identified the auto-renewal clause." In the 3rd addendum, it was written in a hand different from the rest of the contract, which suggested it was added after the original negotiation. It was. My father added it at the supplier's request, as a convenience, or so the supplier described it. It is a convenience for the supplier. £40 annually, compounded over the years since the original agreement, represents a significant sum. I would recommend a renegotiation letter within the fortnight. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You have been here 16 days. Yes. And you have read every account ledger for 7 years. Every account ledger, every lease agreement, every supplier contract, and the relevant correspondence." She paused. "I read quickly when the material is interesting." He looked at her. It was the same quality of look she had noticed at the ball, measuring, not dismissive, not performed. He said, "The tenant agreement recommendations. You project 200 to 240 in annual improvement. Under conservative assumptions, I assumed a 30% rejection rate on the proposed new terms, which I think is high. Most of the existing tenants have been here for more than a decade and will not want the disruption of renegotiation. If we approach it correctly, they will see it as a regularization rather than an increase." "How would you approach it correctly?" She told him. She had already thought it through, the order in which to approach the tenants, the language to use, the specific concessions she would offer in exchange for the market rate adjustment. The one tenant, a man named Briggs who farmed the eastern field and had a long and apparently contentious relationship with the estate's previous manager, who would need a separate and careful conversation. She had been to see Briggs's lease on the third day, not because she had been asked to, but because the file had a notation in the margin that said, "disputed, unresolved," and unresolved things bothered her. When she finished, he said, "You went to the estate records room. On the third day. I had planned to go through those with you. I could not find anyone who had the key, until Mrs. Calvert located it in a drawer in the butler's pantry, and once I had it, it seemed inefficient to stop." There was a pause. She thought he might be displeased. But what she saw on his face was not displeasure. It was something she was less practiced at reading, which was a kind of satisfaction. Not at her specifically, but at the fact that a thing had been done rather than deferred. He said, "The key belongs on the hook in the East office." She said, "I have already put it there." He stayed for another hour. They went through the report section by section. He asked precise questions, and she gave precise answers, and occasionally one of them amended something in the margins, when the discussion produced a better figure or a more careful phrase. It was the most useful conversation Charlotte could remember having in some years, and she held that thought at arm's length afterward, examining it with the same care she applied to account discrepancies, because it seemed important to understand it accurately. He came back 2 days later to discuss the tenant approach strategy. He came back 3 days after that to review the provisions contract draft she had prepared. The conversations were always about work. They were also, she noticed, increasingly unlike conversations about work. She was in the East office late one evening, later than she generally stayed, because she had found an anomaly in the 1814 accounts that she could not resolve without cross-referencing 2 sets of records simultaneously, when she became aware of a sound from the adjacent room. The study. The Duke did not often use the study at this hour. She listened and realized it was music. Or rather, someone was playing. A composition she did not recognize, slow and careful, as though being remembered rather than read. She set down her pen and listened. She had played piano since childhood. It was one of the few things in her education that had been conventional, and she could hear in the playing that this was not performance. This was something private. She did not move for several minutes, not wanting to intrude on it, not quite able to stop listening. The music stopped. There was silence. Then the study door opened, and the Duke appeared in her doorway, still holding a candle, and looked at her with the expression of someone who had not expected company. She said, "Your mother's composition." Something changed in his face, not dramatically, but the way a door changes when a catch is released. He said, "How did you know that?" Mrs. Calvert mentioned she had kept several pieces in the music room. The style is consistent with the early 1800s, but it is not published work. It has the character of something written for a specific space. She paused. "It is very fine." He was quiet. Then he said, "She played every evening, even at the end, when her hands were less reliable. She said the music was more important than the playing of it." It was the most personal thing he had told her. He seemed to know it was, because his expression became careful again immediately afterward, not closed but held. She did not pursue it. She picked up her pen and said, "The 1814 accounts have an anomaly I would like your help tracing. Are you available now, or would morning be better?" He said, "Now." He sat down in the chair across from her, and they worked for another hour and a half. She found the anomaly's source, a payment recorded twice under different headings. a clerical error that had produced a ghost discrepancy she had spent 3 evenings tracking. She said, "There," when she found it, without ceremony, and he leaned forward to see the line she was pointing to, and said, 14 years. That has been in the records for 14 years. 14 years, and nobody went back far enough to find it. She straightened it into the notes column. It does not change the current figures, but it explains a confusion in the 1814 to 1816 sequence that I could not otherwise account for. He was looking at her. She was looking at the ledger. She could feel him looking with the specific attention she had come to understand was just how he looked at things that interested him, and she was not entirely certain what to do with the warmth that produced in her. So she made a note in the ledger and set down her pen and said, "I should let you have the study back." He said, "Charlotte." It was the first time he had used her name without the miss before it. He said it as though he had thought about it. She looked up. He said, "You are not keeping me from the study. The study keeps you from nothing." She held his look for a moment. Then she said, "Good evening, Your Grace. Dominic." She said, "Good evening, Dominic," and kept her face perfectly still, and gathered her ledger and her notes and went to her room, and sat on the edge of the bed, and pressed both hands flat on her knees for a moment, before she went to bed. The study had a door that locked from inside, and it did not lock. Charlotte had come to it each evening for 11 nights, because the East Office, for all its adequacy, did not have the records she needed for the historical category of problems. The documents she needed were in the study's lower shelves, which he had shown her on the 4th day without making a particular point of it. She had gone the first night because she needed a specific file. She had gone on subsequent nights because the files were there, and because the room helped her think, and because it smelled of old paper and a particular kind of order she found steadying. She had not asked permission and he had not offered it, and the first 3 nights he had been absent from the house on estate business. On the 4th night, he had come in at 11 o'clock and found her at his desk and had been still for a moment in the doorway. He had not, as it happened, ordered her removed. He had said, "The fire is low," and crossed to build it up, and then sat in the chair near the window and read until she finished her work. She had said good night. He had inclined his head. On the 5th night, she had not asked, and he had not commented. He had brought 2 candles. By the 11th night they had developed, without discussing it, a working arrangement. She sat at the desk. He sat in the chair. They both worked in silence, until one or the other raised something from what they were reading, and then they discussed it with the economy of 2 people who did not need to perform thinking for each other. On the 12th night he was already in the chair when she arrived, and he said, "The lamp on the desk is better at this hour." She said, "Thank you," and sat down and opened the ledger, and understood, without the need for either of them to say so, that this had become something they were not going to stop. Lady Eleanor Vane made her position explicit in the morning room, 11 days after Charlotte's arrival, on a morning when they were the only 2 people in it. She said, with genuine pleasantness and an absolute absence of subtlety, "I hope you understand that the Duke's family has certain expectations with respect to his future. It is not that you are not admirable, Miss Reeves, only that some matters are governed by arrangements that preceded us all." Charlotte looked at her. She said, "I manage the estate accounts, Lady Eleanor. I manage the tenant agreements, and the supplier contracts, and the household ledgers. I am here to do a job that needed doing. If you have concerns about the Duke's private decisions, I would suggest you address them to the Duke." Lady Eleanor said, "Of course," with the serenity of someone who has not quite heard the answer they expected. Charlotte said, "If you will excuse me, I have a meeting with Hartwell at 10. She was not going to step aside for anyone, but she was also not going to fight a battle on ground that was not hers to claim, not yet, and perhaps not ever, and she held that uncertainty in her chest with the same measured honesty she applied to figures that did not yet balance. The meeting with Hartwell at 10 was productive, in the way that productive meetings are, when one party has done the preparation, and the other party has been expecting a more preliminary conversation. She placed 3 documents on the table between them: the proposed tenant agreement revisions, the provisions contract renegotiation letter, and a summary of the structural account issues she had identified. She walked him through each one with the precision she had developed in 3 years of making cases to people who held authority she did not. Hartwell said, at the conclusion. The Duke has reviewed these? He reviewed the tenant agreement strategy on Tuesday and approved the approach. The contract letter was drafted per his instruction. The account summary is for your reference. She paused. If you have concerns about the scope of my work, I would encourage you to take them to His Grace. Hartwell looked at her over his spectacles. He said, I do not have concerns about the scope, Miss Reeves. I have an obligation to understand what I am working with. Then I hope this is useful. He gathered the documents, he said, with the air of a man being more honest than he had planned to be. The tenant agreements, the Briggs revision in particular. How did you account for the standing dispute? I pulled every piece of correspondence in the file. The original dispute was over a boundary that had been informally moved by a previous estate manager and never formally adjusted. I drafted a boundary clarification as a separate document and proposed that it accompany the lease renegotiation. Briggs will get the formal acknowledgement he has been asking for since 1816, and we will get the adjusted terms. Hartwell was quiet for a moment. Then he said, the file had a notation that the dispute was unresolved. It had been unresolved for 8 years. The resolution was available in the correspondence. It only required someone to read all of it. He set his pen down. He said, Miss Reeves, I will tell you plainly that I came here this morning, expecting to find a woman who had been assigned responsibilities beyond her experience. He paused. I was mistaken in that expectation. She said, Thank you, Mr. Hartwell. She kept her expression level. I expect we will work together well. The Duke's father arrived at Ashworth Park on a Thursday, with no advance notice, which Charlotte suspected was intentional. The elder Duke of Ashworth, or rather, the former Duke's brother, Lord Aldous Ashworth, who held the family's secondary title and who considered himself its moral authority, was 64, precisely dressed, and possessed of the specific displeasure of a man who has received information he does not like and has come to address it personally. He did not acknowledge Charlotte when she passed him in the corridor. He asked Mrs. Calvert where his nephew was. He spent 40 minutes in the study with Dominic with the door closed. Charlotte knew this because she was in the East office, and the walls between the rooms were not particularly thick. She did not intend to listen. She heard nonetheless. Lord Aldous' voice was the one she heard most clearly. Unsuitable. Appeared at least twice. And the position requires an appropriate alliance. And whatever the accounting situation is, it cannot justify. Dominic's responses were lower. She heard the tone but not the words. She returned to the annotated lease agreements and worked through the afternoon. That evening, Dominic came to the East office before dinner. He said, My uncle visited. Yes. He expressed certain views. I gathered something of that, she said, without any particular emphasis. He stood in the doorway and looked at the desk, the organized stacks of documents, the ledger with the annotated index she had developed, the carefully arranged shelves behind her that had been empty when she arrived. He said, You have built a working system in this room. She said, I build working systems. It is what I do. He crossed the room and stood beside the desk and looked at the annotated tenant file she had open. He said, without looking at her, I told him the estate's accounts have improved by a projected £300 in annual income since March. 280. Under the confirmed agreements, we will reach 300 when Briggs signs. He was unimpressed. He was not unimpressed by the figure, she said. He was unimpressed by the source. Dominic looked at her then. She met his look. He said, Yes, I know the difference, Your Grace. She said it without bitterness. It was simply a fact, like a column that balanced or did not. He said, His views are not my views. I know that also. She paused. Your cravat has been crooked since this morning, since before breakfast, I believe. He looked at her, briefly startled. It was the first time she had seen him startled by anything. She stood and straightened his cravat, with 2 careful adjustments, not looking at his face, and then stepped back. Her hands felt the deliberateness of what she had just done. He was very still. She said, It has been bothering me since 9 o'clock. He said, Has it? You are otherwise precisely dressed. It was like a note played in the wrong key. He said her name in the same way he had said it the first time, quietly, as a thing considered. She picked up her pen and returned to the lease file. He said, "Come to dinner." It was not an instruction. She recognized the difference. She said, "Yes," and set the pen down and went to dinner. The formal investor review was called by Alderman Forsyte, which was his right under the estate's financial structure. The three investors jointly held the right to call a review of estate management at any time, with 14 days' notice. A clause that Charlotte had read and noted in her first week, and had subsequently identified as a potential mechanism for exactly what was happening. The notice arrived in the first week of May. The review would take place in the estate's formal drawing room, with all three investors present, the estate's legal representative, and whoever the Duke chose to have present on his behalf. The Duke said, at dinner, 2 days after the notice arrived, "I want you in the room." Charlotte said, "I expected to be in the room," as the presenting party. "Yes," she said, "I assumed." He said, "Forsyte will attempt to reduce the scope of your appointment." "I know. He will imply that a woman in this position is structurally irregular. He is correct that it is structurally irregular. I invented the position." She considered. "I have 14 days. I will prepare." She prepared for 14 days with the thoroughness of someone who knows that the room she is about to enter has been arranged against her, and that the only instrument available to her is the truth, presented so completely that dismissal becomes more work than acknowledgement. She built the presentation document by document, the annotated account analysis, organized by year, with the specific improvements marked and sourced, the 7 tenant agreements signed since her arrival, with the revenue projections for each. The provisions contract renegotiation, concluded the previous week, with the annual saving calculated exactly, £43.04 against a market rate she had sourced from 2 comparable estates and included as appendices. The Briggs boundary clarification, which Briggs had signed, and which had been accompanied by the lease renegotiation, which Briggs had also signed. Every figure had 2 sources. Every projection was labeled as projection and grounded in stated assumptions that could be examined. On the last evening before the review, she was in the study. It was late, and Dominic was in the chair with his own papers, and she said, "There is one thing I have not been able to find." He looked up. "The original 1808 revenue-sharing agreement, between your father and Forsyte's predecessor. It should govern the rate of review. I have the 1814 amendment but not the original. Without the original, I cannot demonstrate that the review mechanism is being used in a way that exceeds its intended scope." He was quiet for a moment, then he said, "It is in the locked drawer." He crossed to the desk and unlocked the lower right drawer with a key from his watch chain, and produced a file folder, old and slightly foxed at the edges. He handed it to her. She opened it and found the original agreement, and read it in silence for 6 minutes. She said, "The review mechanism was intended for material financial concerns. The language is specific. Material decline in estate revenues or significant management failure. The estate's revenues have not declined since March. They have improved." Yes. Forsyte does not have the grounds he thinks he has. If he attempts a formal removal on the basis of this review, he is outside the terms of his own agreement. Dominic said, "Can you demonstrate that in the room?" She said, "I can demonstrate that in the room." He was looking at her with an expression that was not quite what she had previously classified as his expressions. It was quieter than satisfaction, and more particular than respect, and she filed it carefully in the part of her mind that she had been keeping for things she was not yet ready to examine. He said, "I will be in the room." She said, "I know you will be." The morning of the review, she dressed in the better of her 2 good dresses, which was the dark blue wool she had worn only twice. She did her hair with more care than usual. Not because she was uncertain, but because she understood the room she was walking into, and she intended to meet it appropriately. Mrs. Calvert, who had in 6 weeks become the most reliably practical person in Charlotte's daily acquaintance, met her in the corridor with a cup of tea, and said, "The investors arrived a quarter hour ago. Mr. Bates has already been in the biscuits." She paused. "You look very well, Miss Reeves." Charlotte said, "Thank you, Mrs. Calvert," and drank the tea and went to the drawing room. The 3 investors sat on one side of the long table, Alderman Forsyte at the center, round-faced and certain, Sir Philip Crane on his left, with the expression of a man who was present under obligation, Mr. Bates on his right, with the expression of a man who would go whichever way the room went. Hartwell sat at the end with his papers. Eleanor Vane was not in the room, which Charlotte noted. Lord Aldous was not in the room either, which she noted separately. Dominic sat to the side, not opposite the investors, which would have been combative, but in the position of a principal who was present and attending. She read the geometry of it in a second and approved. She took the chair at the table's head, because someone had to, and she had arranged the documents there. She set out her materials in the order she had organized them. She placed the original 1808 agreement at the top. Forsyte began with a prepared statement. It covered the irregularity of the appointment, the concerns about the management approach's suitability, and the investors' collective interest in ensuring the estate was managed by individuals with appropriate qualifications and standing. He did not mention Charlotte's name. He referred to the current arrangement throughout. When he finished, Charlotte said, "Thank you, Alderman Forsyte." She placed the account analysis in front of each investor, using 3 copies she had prepared. "I would like to begin with the estate's revenue position, since the 1st of March, which is the period of the current arrangement." She waited while each man had the document in his hands. The figures on the first page represent confirmed income improvements from signed agreements. The total is £283 in annualized improvement against the figures for the same categories in the prior year. The second page contains the projection for the full year, including the Briggs Agreement and 2 further tenant renegotiations not yet concluded. Sir Philip Crane said, "These are projections." "The projections are labeled as projections, Sir Philip, and the assumptions behind each one are documented in the appendix. The confirmed figures on the first page are not projections. They are from signed agreements. Mr. Hartwell has copies of every relevant document." Hartwell confirmed this with a small nod. She continued through the materials. The provisions contract, the boundary clarification, the account anomalies addressed. Each item presented with its source document and its specific figure. She did not argue. She did not plead. She placed the information in front of them with the precision of someone who understood that the room could not indefinitely dismiss what it had already been shown. When she reached the 1808 agreement, she said, "Alderman Forsyte, the review mechanism under which this meeting has been called specifies that a formal review may be called in the case of material decline in estate revenues or significant management failure. I would ask you to confirm that this is the mechanism you are invoking." Forsyte said, "The mechanism allows for a review of management arrangements. It allows for a review in specified circumstances. The circumstances are defined in the original agreement, which I have here, and which I believe you have also reviewed." She placed her copy on the table in front of him. "The estate's revenues have not declined. They have improved by the figure on the first page of the analysis you have before you. I would ask, in what category does this management arrangement constitute a material decline or significant failure?" The room was quiet. Not the suspended quiet of a social room rearranging itself. The particular quiet of people looking at documents and doing arithmetic. Mr. Bates turned the second page. Sir Philip Crane said nothing. Forsyte said, "The appointment is structurally irregular." Charlotte said, "Yes, it is. The Duke of Ashworth created a new position because the role he needed did not exist in the standard household structure. Creating a new position to meet a genuine need is not a failure of management. It is management." She heard, in her peripheral awareness, something shift in the room to her right, the specific quality of a person becoming very still. She did not look at Dominic. She kept her eyes on the investors. Sir Philip Crane said, to no one in particular, "She is correct about the mechanism." Forsyte said, "The question of appropriateness is not limited to—" "I have addressed the financial appropriateness," Charlotte said. "I have addressed the operational appropriateness. I have addressed the legal basis for this review. If there is another category of concern you wish to raise, I am happy to address it. Otherwise, I believe the materials before you answer the question this review was called to examine." The room did not erupt. There was a long, suspended moment in which the 3 men looked at the documents, and at each other, and at the documents again. Sir Philip Crane turned to Forsyte and said, "I cannot support a finding against an arrangement that has produced these results, Forsyte. The agreement does not support it, and the figures do not support it. Mr. Bates said, "No, no, quite right," in the tone of a man who had been waiting to discover which direction was correct. Forsyte looked at the 1808 agreement. He looked at the account analysis. His face had the particular quality of a man who has entered a room certain of the outcome and is now doing the harder work of revising his certainty against evidence. He said, finally, "The arrangement may continue under review." It was the most he was going to offer, and they all understood it. Charlotte collected her documents. She said, "Thank you, gentlemen," and did not allow her voice to carry any satisfaction, because satisfaction was her own business and not the room's. She was in the corridor outside when she heard steps behind her. She turned and found Dominic there. He was looking at her with the particular expression she had by now learned to read, the one that meant he had identified something he valued. He said, "You had the original agreement. You knew the mechanism. I found it 11 days ago in your desk drawer. I asked you for it the night before." "You had already built the case." "I had already built the case," she agreed. He said, "Charlotte." He said it with the same weight he had brought to it the first time, and the third time, and every time since, each time a little more certain of what it meant. He said, "I would like to speak with you this evening, not about the accounts." She said, "I imagined not." He said, "In the garden, if you are willing." She thought about it in the manner she thought about things that mattered, not quickly, not dramatically, but completely. She said, "Yes." Lord Aldous found her before the garden, in the corridor near the morning room. He was not a man who would seek her out directly, and she understood from the fact that he had done so that something had shifted. He said, "Miss Reeves." He stopped. He appeared to be choosing words with care. He said, "The review. I was told how it concluded." She waited. He said, "I came here with a set of views about this situation that were, it appears, not entirely complete." He said the word complete as though he had replaced another word with it. "The figures you presented. Hartwell showed me the summary." He paused. "The estate has not been managed to this standard in some years." Charlotte said, "No, it has not." He looked at her. He was not a man who apologized. She could see that plainly. But he was also not, at this moment, a man maintaining certainty. He said, "I see that I had formed an assessment on incomplete information." He inclined his head, not warmly, but without contempt, and walked away. She watched him go. Then she picked up her list from the hall table where she had set it, and went to find her coat for the garden. The garden at Ashworth Park had a long path that ran alongside the southern wall of the house, bordered by low hedges that in early May were newly green and very precise, because Charlotte had noted in her second week that the groundskeeper's schedule was irregular and had spoken to Mrs. Calvert about it, and the hedges had been attended to within the week. She found this quietly satisfying. Dominic was already on the path. He was without his coat. He had come directly from the drawing room and had not gone back for it, and in the May evening air he looked, for the first time since she had met him, like a man who had come somewhere without preparing the approach. He said, "I watched you take that room apart, document by document, and not raise your voice once. Raising my voice would not have produced different figures." "No." He was quiet for a moment. "My mother would have liked you. She managed everything with the same refusal to perform anything she could simply do." Charlotte said, "She sounds like someone worth knowing." He said, "She was the only person I did not have to explain myself to." He paused, "Until recently." She looked at the hedge. She looked at the path. She looked at him, and let herself look, which was something she had been careful about until now. He said, "Charlotte, well, I proposed a professional arrangement in March, and I told you the other matter could wait until you had formed an opinion you trusted. I am asking now whether you have formed one." She said, "I have been forming it since about the 4th week. And I have found," she said, with the precision she applied to everything that mattered to her, "that I have become very much not indifferent to this house and to the work and to the person I do the work with. I have found that the evenings in the study have become the part of the day I consider most mine. I have found that I do not want to leave." She paused. "That is a considered answer, not a hasty one." He said, I know. He had taken a step closer, and he was looking at her with the full weight of his attention, which was, she had come to understand, substantial. He said, not because it is convenient or appropriate, or fitted the requirements my position imposes, but because you see the thing in front of you clearly, and you act on it honestly, and you have never pretended, not once, not for an instant, to be less than you are. She held that for a moment. Then she said, yes, Dominic. He took her hand, the bare hand, because she had not put her gloves back on after the meeting, and held it with the same deliberateness he brought to everything he chose to do, and did not let it go. Later, in the drawing room, there had been a moment, she had not arranged it, and she suspected he had not either, when Eleanor Vane and Hartwell and 2 of the estate staff were present, and Dominic had said with the plain clarity of a public fact, Miss Reeves has accepted my proposal of marriage, and had looked at Charlotte with the look that she had learned was his equivalent of anyone else's open expression. Eleanor Vane had gone very still, and then had said, I see, with a serenity that was genuine in its way, because Eleanor Vane was not cruel, she was simply a woman who had assumed an outcome, and was now, with her particular grace, revising it. Hartwell had said, Congratulations, Your Grace, and had looked at Charlotte with the expression of a man who had arrived uncertain and was now, quietly, not. They were married in June, in the church at the edge of the Ashworth Park grounds, on a morning that was clear and unhurried in the way that May mornings occasionally extend themselves into June as a courtesy. And Charlotte wore ivory, which she had not owned before, and which Mrs. Calvert had declared absolutely right on the grounds that she had waited long enough for something that was absolutely right. Dominic had, at the altar, briefly and precisely, straightened his own cravat without being told. He caught her eye immediately after, with a look that said he had done it specifically for her, which was the sort of thing she filed in the part of her mind that was exclusively his. The professional legacy she built took another 3 years to complete, but its foundations were in place by Christmas of the first year. She had begun with the annotated account system she had developed for Ashworth Park, the indexing method, the 2-source verification, the 4-category problem organization. Hartwell had commented, in his precise way, that 2 neighboring estates had asked about the system after it had come up in a solicitors' meeting, and Charlotte had spent the following weeks producing a version that could be adapted to other properties, which Hartwell then distributed with her name on it, which was the first time anything she had built had carried her name officially. She continued from there. Within 3 years, the annotated management system, bound, indexed, with her own introduction explaining its principles, was in use at 6 estates in 3 counties. She had not sought the recognition. The recognition had followed the work, which was, she thought, the correct order of things. There was a son first, Edmund, born the following August, who arrived with a quantity of dark hair that was entirely Dominic's, and a particular expression of focused attention that Mrs. Calvert said was absolutely Charlotte's. Edmund secured the line, the dukedom passed, as it must, and he grew into a child who could be found at age 3, sitting solemnly with his mother's ledgers as though reading them, and who said, when discovered, numbers. It was the most sensible thing anyone had said in that room in years. A daughter followed 3 years after, Marian, who had Charlotte's composure and her father's precision, and who learned early that her mother's East office was the most interesting room in the house. Charlotte had renegotiated her own annotated system 3 times since the first edition. The most recent version sat on the desk in the East office, still the East office, still hers, the room that had held the key to the estate records room from the first week, and had never given it back. The 6th estate to adopt the system had sent a letter addressed to the Duchess of Ashworth, and had described the system as a model of organized estate management that our previous approach had clearly needed. She was at the desk on an evening in October, 2 years into the marriage and 9 months into Marian's presence in the house, when she became aware of Dominic in the doorway. He did this sometimes, stood in the doorway of the East office in the evening, and watched her work with the same quality of attention he had brought to watching her for the first time across a ballroom, the measuring look that had since become something she understood as wholly different from measurement. It was the look of a man who had found the person he had been looking for, without knowing he had been looking, and who had not stopped being grateful for the finding. She did not look up. She said, Edmund is asleep. He is asleep. Marian is not, but Mrs. Calvert has the matter in hand. Come and see what Hartwell sent. She turned the letter toward the edge of the desk. He crossed the room and read it over her shoulder, and she felt his presence behind her, with the settled particularity of a person who has been watching you for 2 years and intends to continue. He said, "The Sixth Estate." Yes. He said nothing else. He simply put his hand on her shoulder, the warm, certain weight of it, and she set down her pen and put her own hand briefly over his, and they stayed like that for a moment, in the East office, with the fire low and the grounds quiet outside, and it was enough. It was, she thought, the exact shape of the life she had built, not arranged for her by anyone, not received as a gift, not survived by stepping aside, built, document by document, figure by figure, clause by clause, in rooms that had not always been designed to hold her, by a woman who had decided, a long time ago, in a cold study with a creditor's letter and her hand against the wall, that she was not going to become less than she was. She picked up her pen and returned to the annotated page, and he stayed, and the room held them both, and it was done.